Here is a blue ink by Sailor 640.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
At first, I thought this might be a blue-black because of how it initially looked, especially the swab. But this is a beautiful, very dark blue in the swab. Nice as a dark blue in the writing with a hint of turquoise at some times. It does change in tone by pen, and generally not in an unexpected way. Even with the tone changes, it still managed to always look like itself, which is pretty cool that it changes tone and still manages to look like the same ink. In general, this is a good shading ink, and it won't let you down in that department. This can easily become a favorite blue for many people because of just how good it always looks on the page.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Ahab. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a nice, clear, easy to read tone on the page, and it is the lightest of what we're going to get. With no feathering, with no spread, with some pretty good shading in every single word. It takes advantages of its lightest tones all the way to the darkest tones. Just look at happened on the second line, where you get to see it start dark, it works to mid, gets lighter towards the end, but darkens up again at the D. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade very well. I think it shades even better than it did with the soft fine for this being a wetter pen. Really shows some of these darks. Again, the reason that I kind of thought this was a blue-black at first was just how it looked in the writing. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the wet fine. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It shades so beautifully. It is absolutely shading at its best. More of what the wet fine did well, this is doing it even better. While it's not showing as many of the lighter tones, mostly the mid to dark, but it's the way that the mid and dark goes back and forth that really is spot on here. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, a little lighter, in fact, than it was with the wet fine. Now, it does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. It does it very well. Just look at that right in the beginning. Mid-tone to dark at the H, down to mid-tone at the A, dark at the T again. Beautiful. Time starting lighter, getting dark at the E. Fantastic the whole way. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get shading similar to, just not as frequently as it happened on the Clairfontaine. I do wish it happened a little bit more frequently here. However, every time it shows up, it's very nice. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Also, seeing a little bit of that turquoise lean that this can sometimes have. Now, it is not feathering or spreading. It is shading, and it is shading, I think, as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Though it's not being the very dark blue, we are, again, it's seeing that little hint of the turquoise that it has. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade very well. Now, I think the shading is showing up nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine, though not as stand out, if that makes any sense. It's because it's the lighter tone, we get to see it a little nicer show up, although I wish as it got darker, like on Destroyed on the second line, I wish the ST could get just a little darker than it was. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but just a little lighter, not tons lighter. It does seem to show a little bit more of the turquoise lean here than it did in the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading, not as well as it did on Clairfontaine. Not as well as it has done with the other nibs on this paper, but it is still shading fairly well. You see it in just about every word. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a tad bit darker than what we were getting on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. Neither of that should be a surprise. We do get some shading. I think the shading is showing a little nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine, which usually I see Clairfontaine as giving me the best example of what we're going to get, but it's not. I think it's doing better here, possibly in contrast to the slight off-white of the paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, which is a much drier pen. It is a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, there is no feathering, there is no spread. It does shade, and yet here, I don't think it's showing itself as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You do see it very well in Dwarves, and you see it in Alive and Inside and He Took All there. You see it, but it stands out better on the Clairfontaine than it did here. Looking at the medium nib, darker than it was with the soft fine, right about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is some shading. I say some because it is there. You get very dark words like that. You get words with some shading like dragons that goes from a mid-tone to dark at the G and lightens up again. So it's there. I would love to see it shading in and out of darker tones while in the same word more. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It is a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering. There is no spread. It does shade. It shades perfectly fine. I don't think the shading that's showing up is as nice as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it is still doing a very good job at bringing the shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, the tone of the paper is really affected this ink, as it tends to. We get no feathering. We get no spread. It's a little darker in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, and we get a little bit more of the turquoise here than we did on any of the other papers. The shading's still happening. I think the shading is happening better here than it did on the Clairfontaine. Perhaps the absorbent nature is actually helping it do a little bit better. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is certainly much more turquoise leaning. Now it's like it's like a very blue leaning turquoise now. With no feather, with no spread, with shading, yes indeed. Look at certain. Starts dark, goes to a nice mid-tone, but goes from dark to mid-tone to dark again. Lives on the second line goes from a lighter all the way down to a nice light tone, working its way all the way dark again. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the wet fine. It is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is still very turquoise leaning on this paper. It's the paper, not the ink. No feather, no spread, very nice shading. Absolutely doing a great job here. I think the only disappointment someone would experience is a result of the toned paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium nib. It is about the same tone as far as how dark it is as the Clairfontaine, though it looks entirely different because it is much more of that turquoise than blue. No feather, no spread, absolutely beautiful shading. It is shading better here, or the shading looks better here than it did on the Clairfontaine, quite possibly because it's more of that turquoise helping it stand out better than it did with the blue.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Blackstone Barrier Reef Blue. Here is Camlin Royal Blue. Here is Diamine Indigo. Here is Noodler's Revolution Blue. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a tone that is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, and as has been the case with this paper, a little flatter of a tone. Now, it does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. The shading is very subtle, but it is definitely there. Take a look at the second line, they. You see it gets a bit darker at the HE, lightens out a little bit to the Y, where had goes a darker to a little bit lighter, a little darker. The shade's there, not huge steps in the shade like we saw with some of the other nibs on papers. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is just a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Actually, as a tone, it's between where the soft fine and fine was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get very nice shading throughout here. It's the paper that usually doesn't have a whole lot of shading qualities that get to come through with it. So when shading gets to come through on this paper, I'm always very happy about it, and especially to point it out. It's shading well. It could be better, of course, but it's not doing bad. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, feels a little disappointing, does have a little bit of a turquoise lean to it. I don't care for how this is looking, that nib on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It is quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is also not as blue as it was on the Clairfontaine. It's blue towards turquoise. The turquoise is coming through here. It's interesting enough, but if you're expecting a blue, this could feel a little disappointing. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade, not super stand out. Like you see some spots where it occurs. We could largely expect it not to be shading here, though. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have no issue with ghosting and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Kayono Oto Imeyu Iro. Here is an orange ink by Krishna Orange. Here is a magenta ink by Krishna Azalea. Here is a yellow ink by Califolio Horidori. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a bit darker, a little bit darker, not like it's tons, than the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit anywhere it gets darker. It does spread a bit. In general, it's got some spread, but it spreads more when it gets darker. And so, yes, it does shade, but with some of that shading comes some feathering and spread. Overall, what I'm seeing is not horrible as a performance on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is showing a little bit more of the turquoise but it looks like a very blue-leaning turquoise at this point, rather muted in tone. Yes, it does feather. Yes, it does spread. Both the feathering and spread do increase anywhere it gets darker. I mean, yes, it does shade, but sometimes shading and 20-pound paper don't go well together. Looking at the medium nib, it's only a tad bit darker than it was with the wet fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does show off some of that turquoise that is in this ink. I think what we're seeing is very manageable. There's no shading, which in itself is okay. I think it's a manageable color we're getting. It's just a matter of if that's really what you want. For me, that's not what I want from this ink. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone as the medium, bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does both of those anytime it gets a little bit darker. Now, in general, there is the spread that this ink has. In general, the spread occurs without the feathering. When it gets darker, we get the feathering. So, yes, it does shade. Doesn't necessarily look great when it does it. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that there's plenty of ghosting going on. The ink does get deep into the paper, but nothing came through and touched the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
I enjoyed this in every pen I used it in, and I always liked it, but it is the medium flow, medium nib on Clairfontaine that really looked its best to me. I just had a little more of the overall good stuff, and that good stuff in the medium flow, medium pen carried over to most of the other papers. So I'm on a medium flow, medium pen to really enjoy it. Unless you like that turquoise coming through, then by all means go with a little bit drier than medium flow, not a dry, but a little bit drier than medium, broad, and you're gonna get it.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.